Hi, everyone. If you're starting to join, we're very grateful for you joining us today. We're going to give it a couple of minutes for other people to join as well. Yeah, take a moment. What I'd love you to do is use the chat function if you've joined already, just to tell us who you are, what organization you're from, where you're dialing in from, and also tell us a little bit about the challenges that your organization is facing and what made you want to join this webinar. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Just going to give it a couple of more minutes for people to join. Great to see some of you already with us. Please use the chat function just to say who you are, where you're from, the organization, and if you want, share with us a little bit about some of the challenges your organization is facing and why you wanted to join this webinar. I see a couple doing that already. Hi to Nick Haley from International Alert. Says he needs new forms of collaboration and mergers between organizations to continue having impact. It's exactly what this webinar is about. Great to see you. Yunus Mohammadi from the Greek Forum of Refugees based in Greece. Thank you for joining us. And Meryl Sovna, the Alternative Resourcing for Change and Solidarity Roundtable. Great to have you with us. Elizabeth from El Salvador, volunteering at an organization called Funzel on sea turtle conservation. Great to see you. Really wide range already of people doing different work and from different places. Great to see that. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes for folks to join. Hello to Hernan Albero, who's from Forum 2000. Also to Isa, the Executive Director of African Students for Interfaith Tolerance, and the many others who've joined as well. Please carry on putting your name, your organization, and some thoughts about the challenges you're facing and the reasons for joining this webinar in chat. I may read out some more of them. We're going to get going in probably one more minute. It's great to see so many of you joining us from all over the world. Daniel from Flowminder Foundation, great to see you. Hi, Namaz Karimov. Hi, Louis Bickford, Linda Miller, Chris Prue, Shirley Gunn. Lots of people signing in. That's great to see. Okay, folks, I think let's get going. Let's be respectful of people's time today. Thank you very much for taking a moment just to say who you are and where you're from. It's great to see so many people doing so much amazing work from so many different parts of the world and time zones joining us today. I'm Rajesh Mirchandani. I'm the founder and CEO of Storyteller Consulting, which is a communications advisory helping social impact organizations tell better stories. Stories of purpose, stories of change, stories of impact, stories that meet the moment. And there's never been a more important moment, I believe, for organizations like yours to be clear about what your story is. That's why I'm really keen for us to have this conversation today, and I'm delighted to be your host. You don't need me to tell you, these are brutal times. There are unprecedented challenges for nonprofits, particularly international development nonprofits. In fact, a latest survey that we're going to hear about shortly suggests that 60% of global development nonprofits have about 6 months or less of financial resources remaining. And almost a third have laid off or furloughed more than 50% of their staff. This isn't just as a result of USAID. Other sources of development finance have also decreased. The point is, and if you haven't realized this, then this is the time to do it. Things are not going back. This is an inflection point. So if that's your organization, you need to make some tough choices. What help is there for you? How should you be thinking about that right now? What should you be thinking about? That's what this webinar is going to help you with. In my work with nonprofits, I see organizations still trying to do everything or just cutting back at the edges, slicing here, slicing there. It's valiant because so much needs to be done. But is it strategic? And is it sustainable? Or are you storing up problems, bigger problems for later, especially if you're asking the same or fewer people to do more with less? Today, we're going to hear from a couple of international development nonprofits that have also gone through dramatic reductions in funding. One is Accountability Lab, which works to make citizens more informed, leaders more responsive, and institutions more accountable. And the other is Development Gateway, an IREX venture that builds digital tools and systems to improve data use for development. Their leaders and co-leaders are here. Josh Powell is the CEO of Development Gateway. Just give a wave, Josh. There he is. Do it again. There we go. Bigger wave. There we go. And Sherry Lee Erasmus is the co-CEO of Accountability Lab. Two hands, jazz hands. I love that, Sherry. For me, what's interesting talking to these organizations throughout the year is that they realized early on that there's no going back to the way things were. And they innovated to find ways that development organizations can survive and maybe emerge stronger. And that's how a new initiative called Civic Strength Partners was created to help development nonprofits figure ways out of those potentially existential challenges that you're facing right now. We're going to hear about that today. We're also going to hear from someone who's supporting this initiative. Rachel Hughey is Senior Officer in the Executive Office of the Conrad Hilton Foundation. Say hi, Rachel. There she is. They decided to help. Today we're going to hear why and how. I'm going to moderate our conversation with our panelists, and then we're going to open it up to questions. There's a Q&A function, so please use that. But please also continue using the chat to pick up on things that you've heard, make comments, post comments, and maybe you want to post questions there. If you want your questions addressed later on, though, I'm going to encourage you to use the Q&A function. Okay. Let's get into the conversation. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us. Let me start with Sherry and Josh, the two of you, the two organizations who are really behind this initiative. I want to go back to February. Start by giving us a sense of what your own organizations faced in terms of cuts when we started hearing about that in February and the implications that you faced of those.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rajesh. At Accountability Lab, for those of you who don't know, we work across countries in South Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and as a network, a translocal network. And for us, the cuts were pretty hard hitting. We lost more than 50% of our funding, sort of across multiple countries. In some countries, we were primarily implementing on US government funded projects, which meant that there were sort of entire offices of L reliant on USG funding. So the implications were really rapid for us of understanding not just how do you make sense of this new, almost rapidly unraveling relationship with your donor, but how do you also maintain some semblance of normalcy while figuring out what's next for staff members whose projects were directly affected in places with a different HR and legal structure, perhaps than where we are based. So there were just a lot of dominoes falling at the same time. And because we work in these different places, we could also directly see through our partners and fellow implementers on the ground that the impact was really hard hitting for so many organizations.
Josh?
Yeah, for us, I mean, I think among organizations headquartered in DC, we were what many would call lucky in that we only lost a third of our funding. But obviously, that has kind of really immediate kind of dynamic impacts overnight in terms of many of the programs that we were doing. A couple of which 6, 7, 8 months later actually have been restarted, which is also an interesting trend to see which elements of USG funding are coming back around. So for us, we had to make some really quick actions to make sure that we're really clear on our cash flow. We're really clear on where individuals across the team had been working, where there is space for them to continue, and so forth. And then I think the other kind of band of impact that we saw is Development Gateway also operates the Open Gov Hub, which is a co-working space for nonprofits and social good organizations based in DC. And so we have over 70 member organizations there. So we're very immediately seeing the impact that this had on so many different organizations, and also the ways that organizations were trying to come together to share intel, to share ideas, and so forth. And so I think we could see not only the impact for ourselves and the impact that that had on the hub, but also the broader community.
And Rachel, your perspective is different as a funder, but what were your grantees and partners? What was the flavor of those conversations you were having 9, 8, 9 months ago?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rajesh. Thanks for including us in this conversation. So the Hilton Foundation, we're headquartered here in Los Angeles, California, but about half of our work is global, half of our budget. And so immediately we started hearing from partners. And I'd say it was a huge range as far as the degree of impact, as Josh and Sherry have kind of stated as already. It was deeply human. It was really painful, I think, for a lot of folks. And kind of the buckets of what those conversations felt like. I would say it was talking about people, right? How many of our colleagues and staff are we going to have to let go in this moment? How many of our community members are we no longer going to be able to serve? And then timelines is the other piece. Okay, so looking at our numbers, as Josh described, we have a 3 month, we have a 6 month, this is the runway that we have. And then the other piece that I could see as a funder that was kind of evaporating in real time was this connective tissue role that development funding plays, the convenings that were being canceled, the conversations that were no longer taking place. And I think that is also was a little bit scary for our partners and for us as well.
And I think that, for me, speaks to a wider dimension of this, which is not only were services being cut straight away, which means lives being lost on the ground. Let's not hide away, shy away from that. But the connective tissue you talked about, that's the knowledge sharing, that's the
Mhm.
systems that have been built up, the intellectual property, just the expertise and the networks of people. So I'd love it. Maybe Josh, you could do this. What's the larger dimension of the potential loss of the cuts beyond services and the impact they have on the ground to a sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, there's all the intellectual property, there's everything from digital tools to methodologies to, other knowledge products. And I think particularly when organizations unfortunately have to sunset, that's often, especially if you're doing things rapidly, often not front of mind in terms of how do you do that well. Our colleague Sean McDonald talks about, for example, tide pool infrastructure. What are some of the different ways that you can come in and create a bit of a liminal space where intellectual property might be able to live and exist and then ultimately be rehomed, for a mission-driven purpose. And the other piece, as you said, is really the expertise. I mean, you see thousands and thousands of people, suddenly, leaving the sector. obviously, most acutely, we were able to see it directly here in DC, but as Sherry said, we all work in many different countries. I heard just yesterday that in one of the countries where we worked, there's an estimated 40,000 people in country who lost their jobs because of USAID program cuts. And then you multiply that out to, a household size of, 4 or 5 is the average in that country. And you have, 200,000 livelihoods immediately impacted. And as you said, then, these are people who may not be able to find a space in the sector to continue on. That's expertise and knowledge that's lost, and relationships and experiences that are lost as well.
If I could maybe jump on that for a minute, Rajesh, there's another piece of this that is a loss of security as well, and I mean physical security, especially seeing this amongst folks who work on issues like governance, um, anti-corruption, investigative journalists, people who had a layer of protection as a result of the funding they had, which disappeared overnight. Frontline defender type folks working on human rights, environmental rights. That is massive, especially when you're in countries facing malign governments. And we saw really quickly in some countries how governments moved to tighten the noose on CSOs and organizations who are playing an advocacy or accountability role, because suddenly that sort of a bit of the diplomatic tissue that was creating a veneer with the US government and creating some sense of security that was gone. And very
Mhm.
physically, people no longer had resources to protect themselves as well. So I think those repercussions are actually quite big too.
Yeah, and often not even just that the protections are gone or the diplomatic, but even the rhetoric that was used here domestically was then echoed back from those country governments to say, even the United States government has declared that this organization is disloyal, is undermining local governance, et cetera. And so then we're able to basically use that as justification for further closing civic space and threatening.
Yeah, look, I think no one on this call is under any illusion that what happened was devastating and a tragedy for many people in many, many different ways. Let me get us to pivot. Let's think about you guys, your organizations, Accountability Lab and Development Gateway. You guys, I mean, you work together very closely anyway, so it's not like you were strangers. You know each other very well anyway. How did you come to the realization that, all right, there is a way forward if we actually make some really drastic changes through restructures, mergers, deep partnerships? You came to that pretty early on. I remember we had our first conversations as early as February about this idea. Where did you come up with that idea? And what are the benefits to development organizations of the kind of decisions that are really tough but really needed?
I think this is a big question, and especially the benefits part has an array of potential answers. But I could maybe start with a bit of the origin story and how we came up with this idea. So we at Accountability Lab and later joined by Momentum as well. Shout out to Chris on the call. We started very early on getting data in from organizations to better understand the impact on them. And as you mentioned in your intro, Rajesh, the data was obviously devastating with regards to very short financial runways. Very early on, people had to start looking at not just furloughs and layoffs, but we now know that there's about half of the organizations we've heard from are also looking at either closing one, multiple offices, or their entire organization might be at risk of closure, right? We also know that funding runways are not necessarily getting better because people have not secured alternative funding, and pipelines are pretty dry for many organizations, depending on sector. And so what emerged really quickly was that there are organizations who may have project work that is still um, viable and for which they still have funding, but there are pieces of their work and organization that they can no longer fund. For example, their back office, right, which um, become really hard to sustain. Also, because if you previously had, for example, bilateral funding from the US, government, you may have quite a big compliance structure in your organization that put you in that space where you built a big back office, which is now unsustainable potentially. So it became clear that there could be a life raft for organizations' missions and some of their projects if they were to band together, consolidate with others, or find other ways of working. For example, cutting back on back office costs through types of consolidation with organizations and banding resources together. I think there are a lot of opportunities and benefits that this brings about. First and foremost, preserving a mission, if you feel like your organization ought to exist and it has a unique or really valuable contribution to make to the ecosystem. Um, and then I think this provides people with a really, it's not the way we wanted to come to this opportunity, but there's an opportunity here to think about things that I think we should have been considering before January of 2025, which is that we were in a rather bloated ecosystem, as it were. And now we're forced to rethink how we work together. I'll pause there and let Josh jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rajesh, one of the things he said earlier is that, this isn't just about USG. I mean, this has been, there has been, I would say, a cap and kind of gradual decline in development assistance and kind of direct funding available to organizations for a long time. And in the case of Development Gateway, I think we've been thinking about this issue for a number of years. And even going back to early in my career at DG 15 years ago, we've had strategic partnerships with U.S. universities. We've incubated and spun out other nonprofits. 4 years ago, we created a strategic partnership with a larger INGO called IREX. And in the 4 years between that and all the fallout with USAID, I had easily a dozen different CEOs of kind of peer organizations, similar size, approach me to say, I'm really interested in exploring something like this. How did you do it? Who approached who? How did you design the governance? So it was already, I think, on a lot of leaders' minds. But I would say that normatively, it was also a very kind of sensitive topic. No one ever wanted their funders to catch wind that they might, be looking at something like this because it could impact grants, or, they didn't want others to know because there might be panic that maybe that organization wasn't doing well, and that was the reason. And so I think that those norms were actually holding back a lot of collaboration and a lot of value. And so, as Sherry said, this is certainly not the way we would ever wanted this to have happened. But I think it is galvanizing, something that we could collectively turn into, some positive elements in terms of deeper collaboration, in terms of better exchange of knowledge and skills, and more efficiency.
Hmm. Rachel, what's the funder's view here? When Josh says no one wants their funder to get wind of them making serious changes, what's the funder's view?
I get it. I mean, I think that is a fair concern for organizations and one that we've heard as well. A few things I wanted to add was that first, so actually domestically in the US, there's a kind of robust ecosystem around sustained collaboration because, Josh, to your point, you need third-party entities to help facilitate this matchmaking, this process, to let people know about the range of partnerships available. So for us, when I first spoke to Blair about this, it wasn't a new idea. And so that made it kind of easier to get behind. And then I just also wanted to plus one to Sherry's point about the global development ecosystem. So the Hilton Foundation has been kind of trying to lead the charge on locally led development for years now, along with, a former administrator of USAID and others. And so in this moment of absolute crisis, and I never want to underplay how terrible it is and how many people have been impacted, but there is an opportunity to rebuild in a way that is more effective and more community centered. And so that's something that is front of mind for us. The other piece I would add from a funder's perspective, it really forces clarity and organizational purpose and how you're structured, greater sustainability, increased reach. I think when organizations come together, there's actually an opportunity to diversify your fundraising sources, right? Because you're bringing together different pools. Maybe one organization is really good with individual donors who don't know what we're talking about right now, right? And others have a robust list of foundation partners. And the last piece I would add as far as, opportunities that come out of this is the advocacy play. I think we've created a really and again, this is a bit to Josh's point, we've created a really competitive environment where it's the incentives have been for folks not to work together because you're looking for scarce dollars. But now that organizations are in some ways being forced to align more, I think there's an opportunity to collectively advocate. And I've seen that even actually at some of the largest INGOs, looking at different ways to form alliances, different ways to share back offices. So I think there are some opportunities there.
If organizations are interested in taking kind of quite dramatic steps, where should they start? What should they start thinking about? And what are watch outs for them to be aware of? Go for
I'm
it,
happy to
Jerry.
go. I can go first. I mean, I think that it really does start with that clarity, Rajesh, that I think you highlighted and Rachel as well. I mean, there has to be a very clear sense of, and it can't just be about the organization, but it has to be about the mission. What is the unique value add, and what is the purpose for existing? And then you can start to think about what forms best serve, that mission, both in this moment and beyond. I think, in terms of watchouts, I think what we've often seen is that a lot of leaders are beginning with the tactical. It's either, this group approached us and it's an interesting conversation, or, I need to do something. And so, my board is, eager for us to look at these. There's a lot of that kind of external pressure, and a lot of leaders are also in a moment of overwhelm and also in many cases a moment of trauma. And so it's difficult then to say, how do you slow down? How do you go back to the initial, purpose? And then start to think about, is this we need to be acquired, or we should be looking at teaming up with organizations that we've been competing with, or, we need to look at a localization model in a much more serious way, and I think that's kind of a critical starting point.
Jerry, just before you come in, let me just follow up on something there, Josh. You said it's not about the organization, it's about the mission. But we need to clarify what mission we're talking about. And this is, I think, where it gets a little tricky because it's not necessarily about your organization's mission. It's the bigger mission. It's the why you exist. It's a step back from your articulated mission. What is the change in the world that you can help effect? And it's about taking some of that identity, maybe you want to say ego, out of it and saying, how do we actually make sure that we can have the impact that we want to have in the world? It may be that we subsume our brand into somebody else's. And that is a really tough call, particularly probably for boards as well. But how do you actually take that out of what you're doing and make sure you're focused on the people that you serve? Sherry, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Rajesh, you actually said something that I've seen in a number of conversations, and it's that there's a vast spectrum of how these conversations go between executives and their boards, in my experience. Some who have really deep relationships and whose boards are also engaged and understand the sector very well, um, and who have made peace with this is a new transforming normal. I think they're more open to working towards transformation. I also see conversations where it's a real struggle to even bring up this conversation or how to do it, and how do you get a more traditional board that's maybe a bit more at arm's length. Engaged in this conversation. And I think there's actually an opportunity here to think about how we use our boards as stronger partners, and for generative conversation that's ongoing and thinking strategically, so that when these things happen, it's not this cataclysmic, how do we even look at this, but that foresight and strategy should be part of how we operate together anyway. So that's, I think, also one good thing that comes out of this, different ways of engaging with government. I think you were asking what should people be on the lookout for. I think, it's easy to say this group has approached us, or this is a model we could potentially convert our organization into. But it's really important to also think about sort of like, what are the cultural and operational deal breakers? What's the makeup of your organization and its mission, and how does that align with another? Because bringing two organizations together means bringing together policies, operations, people, which could have an impact, like in a change of how you engage with your partner organizations, and the folks who you serve. And so ultimately, I think that's a key consideration as well, understanding what your red lines are around those things and how you streamline it. Because I think a lot of these types of transformations can actually collapse very quickly as a result of culture.
Yeah, culture trumps strategy. We always know that. Yeah. One thing, Josh, when you and I were talking on the phone earlier this week, just ahead of this webinar, you'd also talked about people come to you with an idea to merge or with a great idea, don't always go for the thing that's on the table. And this goes back to really being clear about what it is that you're here to do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, going back to also, Sherry's red lines, and there's almost an alchemy of mission and organization. And I think, that the culture and the delivery model and the partnership model and all of those different things make a lot of sense. And also, I think that what we've seen often is that organizations start a conversation around one form of partnership and then ultimately settle on often a very different form, because maybe there are some of those differences where there's complementarity there, and not all kind of structured collaboration needs to be a merger. And so we've certainly been advising a number of organizations where maybe they started off in this direction, still see the value proposition of the partnership, but end up going in a bit of a different, direction. I think the risk there is that sometimes half measures can become very appealing of, we can kind of have both sides of this. We can keep our brand, we can keep control, we don't have to, worry about, teams and so forth. And then kind of magically this collaboration will lead to more and new revenue. So I think it's just really important to take a really hard look and to interrogate some of those assumptions really deeply as well.
Have you had to have some of those conversations?
Yes, absolutely. I think probably where I've been most involved in terms of kind of supporting other organizations have been kind of periodic, almost I would say peer coaching, sessions, having gone through this
Mm.
myself, and Sherry and the team at the lab have gone through so many, I think, really interesting transitions, both in terms of their approach to co-leadership, different labs that have come into the network and different forms of partnership. And so I think that is one of the things that we've tried to do that's a bit unique is rather than just coming at it with a pure consulting lens and saying, okay, you could increase revenue by X or cut costs by Y, being able to come in as a kind of, peer leader and CEO to say, here are some of the things that I would be thinking about. Here are some of the things I would want to know from my team, from my board, and so forth. And I think those have been really, for me, I've always also learned quite a bit from how different leaders have been thinking about this themselves.
Mhm. So let's learn more, Cherry and Josh, about the tools that you guys set about creating to help organizations think about major structural or operational changes. Can you explain some of those? And folks, if you're on the call, feel free to add any questions that you want the panelists to address using the Q&A box, or if you want to put them in the chat for everyone to see, that's also fine too.
Good. I could start here, and I just would want to preface this by saying that this is very much um, an ongoing build out of a project, where we're learning as we go, and so much of the tool development is also really based on learning from the conversations we're having, identifying needs, and then iterating. Where we are now in terms of how we approach this work is actually different to what we envisioned in a way it would be even in March or so when we started. So one of the things we developed was a toolkit to help organizations who are thinking about a transformation think through some of the core questions, right? Because people don't often know even where to start. And again, not just within their team, but also with their board, what are the key considerations? Um, our whole structure is also built on ongoing accompaniment, which means that we've created really a service design that ultimately brings people in, but then walks the walk with them and plugs in services at the right time. So each organization that works with us has a core consultant working with them. When there are legal questions and services needed, those get plugged in, whether it's communications or other consulting services. We have a roster of folks around the world that we've curated and vetted, and we're then able to plug in the services that people need. And then as we go, we're continuing to develop other other pieces of toolkits that could be put out there for organizations thinking through it. One of the things we're working on now with our partners at the International Senior Lawyers Project is a legally focused toolkit to highlight what are the questions even that you should be grappling with legally before you even go to, for example, your legal counsel. So that people are prepared, because often nonprofit organizations, even with our services, it's not like you have hundreds of hours to use, right? So you want to know what are the key things you want to prioritize when you have time to speak to legal counsel, and have those conversations in-house, have some answers ready also with folks in your governance structure. And as we continue to build this project out, these needs that we're identifying, we're continuing to build out.
Yeah, and just to add, I mean, I think we've tried to be really careful not to reinvent the wheel on anything. So, for example, Humentum did some great work on what are some of the different types of structures and collaboration models, and research on that that's been really useful. There's other materials that are out there, and so we've tried to make sure that the knowledge products that we're developing, as Sherry said, are things that are internally useful, things that we're kind of hearing direct demand from, and that we ourselves haven't been able to kind of find out in kind of open access avenues. And so I think that's been really critical. The other thing that we've done is basically set up a matchmaking function, and I think Rachel touched on this earlier. Sometimes it's very clear for organizations of, oh, we should be exploring partnership with this organization or that organization. Other times it's much less so, or maybe actually your particular area is quite saturated and you need some difference and some complementarity to be able to kind of diversify. One other thing that we're doing right now is supporting a cohort of organizations who are looking at basically different funding models and what that can look like. And so, to Elizabeth's question in the chat, I do think there's a need to look beyond just kind of grant and project modalities. I think there's also a need to be really clear on what types of investments does that require for your organization. If you're trying to pivot to fee for service, if you're trying to pivot to corporate partnerships, et cetera, those are often their different fundraising models, their different delivery models, their different cost structures. There's so many differences to that. And so I think in the first few months, we saw a very knee-jerk reaction of, organizations saying, oh, I've been doing this, there's money over here. I just need to pivot quickly. But there is a need to step back and be thoughtful. And I think often a strategic partnership is the right way if you have organizations with complementary funding models to be able to try to bring those together as well.
If I can just say a
Rachel,
little,
oh, please go ahead.
just on the alternative revenue models, I think, Elizabeth, you are right on there. There's an opportunity here to reflect on those. I do think this is another space where we have to think more expansively. As nonprofit organizations, we often think about our work at a programmatic or project level. And this is forcing us to think about our assets, right? That are unique and powerful beyond a project, but that can be sold elsewhere. I do think there's a little bit of this is a tightrope. I also think there's opportunity for great saturation if everyone's trying to, for example, sell training services or these things that we were doing within a donor context before, because who exactly are we selling them to? Are we selling them to each other in a very resource constrained space already? So I think this is where like mapping your unique assets and skills within your organization become critical, because otherwise we're advertising the same services to each other.
That's interesting. Another watch out. Rachel, as a funder, I'm interested to get a sense from you or get your perspective. what made you want to get behind this work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of it was what we said in the beginning, that this is such a shock to the system, and just a deep fear that we were going to lose institutional knowledge, individuals with deep professional expertise and impact on the field. And so, in those early days in January and February and March, we were as an institution, but also as philanthropy, trying to figure out what our role is, right? Philanthropy cannot backfill ODA funding. We can't backfill even just USA. That's an absurd premise. And so where are places where we can leverage our resources to um, increase the impact of the organizations doing this great work in the field? And this to me was one key way to approach that, a little bit of an experiment. And then just second, because there's a few different initiatives that have this approach, as I said, mostly domestically, but Civic Strike Partners in particular, the pieces that Sherry and Josh just laid out, being more of an accompaniment model, being led by folks who have personal experience in this space. I've been in philanthropy now for over a decade, and I really believe that projects succeed or fail often based on relationships and the humans that are involved, and not so much on the metrics and the tables. Don't tell our evaluation team that. And so having folks who understand how deeply personal this process is, and that it's not just about lining up balance sheets, was a big selling point for us. And I think it always, if there are other funders on the call, I think this always has to go through a third party entity. Like, one of my big fears um, in this period of disruption is that philanthropy or other donors will start picking winners or start trying to matchmaking folks. And I think that that's just not appropriate, because we don't have the knowledge and the experience to do that well. And because people are not always going to be honest with us, as Josh said. So, yeah.
Why is that a fear of yours?
Um, I think that this work should be community driven and driven by the needs on the ground. And philanthropy, at least the large institutions, like the one that I'm involved with, we have strategic priorities. We have specific sectors that we want to see thrive. And I think that's all done through a very thoughtful process. And I think that's important to be applying our work in that with that level of analysis and drive towards impact. But when disruption is this wide and this broad across all the field, all of the sector, I think it's important that it's really comes from community and organizations leading on that.
So in a couple of minutes, we're going to open up to audience questions. I see one person has put a question there. Thank you so much, folks. This is the time to kind of add your questions in. I just want to kind of like round out my conversation with the panel just with a couple more points. I'd love to get a sense from you, what has been the experience of so far of the organizations that you have been working with, who've come to you and said, we need help? What have they been? What have been some of Josh, you mentioned that in some instances you've redirected them, but what else are they coming to you with? What are some of the questions or concerns or the things they need help with that helps you tailor what services you provide? And are there any that have had kind of outcomes that you can share? Obviously, this is a sensitive area, so people are less keen to kind of be identified, which is fine. But if you're able to anonymize or generalize any of the kind of experiences that people have brought to you, I think that will be interesting to folks to hear.
I can start. I mean, I think it's been such a wide range. I mean, we've had, everything from leaders just kind of coming and saying, I don't know where to start. Can you just have, effectively often, from someone of our team giving a bit of a coaching, session of here are some of the things to think about to get yourself ready to be able to have, real explorations. In other cases, we've had some where two partners have come together and they've said, we're basically ready to lock this thing up and we just need some help, dotting I's and crossing T's. And in some of those cases, those actually ultimately didn't come together for various reasons. And I think a lot of that comes back to taking the time with leaders to come back upstream and to be very clear, both on the mission and the why, but then to Sherry's line also, what are the red lines? And we've seen everything from, it's about board composition, it's about, who's the CEO or leadership team composition or brand. And I think that's kind of been a really critical lesson from this is not only to be honest with yourselves about what those red lines are, but actually I think there's been a bit of a sense from leaders of, okay, we need to build trust before we can say the things that might blow this up. And actually, by saying the things that could blow it up early, not only are you respecting people's time, but you actually build trust in the process because you're being open and often vulnerable in those conversations. And I think the other thing I'd just say, coming back to Rachel's point, I think that norms have been shifting, and we've actually seen a lot of philanthropic funders and program officers who, in addition to potentially, underwriting or providing some financial support to organizations looking at this, have been really critical thought partners. And I think that as that dynamic shifts, where leaders feel more comfortable talking to their funders about what they're going through, what pivots they're considering, what partnerships they're considering, I think there's a really crucial role for program officers to play in stress testing those assumptions, particularly from a market perspective. Because, I think it's really critical that we don't have kind of magical thinking of, well, if we do this, we can definitely pivot over here. And I think that the funders who speak to each other and really have a good sense of the market are some of the best sounding boards for those conversations.
Okay, great. Just looking at the chat, some good comments and questions coming up in there. There's one here which I'll just read out. I think it's actually been answered by other people in chat, which is great. I think it's Louis Bickford. Could you provide some examples of NGO mergers, perhaps also articles that refer to those specific examples? And Louis goes on to give some examples that they've heard about. But actually, a couple of people have responded to that. Chris Prue. We formed Humentum as a three-way merger in 2017. He's happy to chat further about what worked and what didn't work. And then Lisa Key is also suggesting looking at Kate Harris's group's website for a thing called Merger Monday series. Panelists, I don't know if you have any other examples off the top of your head. This might also be the type of question that benefits from a post-fact response, although Josh has just answered it already. Global communities have also done multiple large-scale mergers. Okay, I think that's answered Louis' question. There you go. There's another question here in chat from Tamira Samuel. How would you advise organizations who provide services in oversaturated markets to approach partnerships and mergers when so much of our brand's values, mission, purpose, and work is similar? Who'd like to go with that, Sherry?
Yeah, and I think this is kind of the heart of the matter here. I think once you decide as an organization, we have to transform, the space has evolved around us, we may not survive, or at least in the form that we are now. I think you have to be really open to laying down your logo and understanding that you may not survive in your current form or actually at all, because saturation is part of the problem. And so I do think I mean, my first suggestion would be to look at organizations around you where work is not necessarily even the same, but complementary, um, so that together you might form a stronger package. But there are so many things around this to consider, which is, this is not like I'm not delivering a flowery message here. But if it's not well thought out how, for example, two organizations in a saturated market are really stronger and have a better runway and a better pipeline together, then we're just looking to merge organizations who fold together 6 months down the line, right? So it's really critical to understand the how you're stronger together, mapping those partners, what's the complementarity, and not just in the what and how we do it, but the how we resource it. And if that does not open up pathways for a shared vision that is resourceable, then that becomes a major challenge.
Mm, Interesting. Let's move to some of the questions that people have posted in the Q&A box. This one from Yana Gridneva, apologies if I got that wrong. How do we reimagine our relationships with governments? Historically, INGOs have often functioned as instruments of foreign policy, meant neutrally, not negatively, this person says. But today, more and more governments are distancing themselves from the very values on which this sector was founded. That raises difficult but necessary questions, this person goes on. Should we consider liberating ourselves entirely from institutional funding? And is private funding truly more flexible and reliable, especially when transparency requirements are often lower than those applied to democratic governments? I think there's quite a lot of questions in there. Rachel, you have unmuted. I don't know if that's just that you want to dive in on this or you just hit the button accidentally.
No, I can provide a few early thoughts. I don't think I can. I think these are questions that we are all grappling with together. And if anyone claims to have a clear answer, I think that, um, yeah. But and I'll focus more on the second part of the question because I think we do all need to reimagine our relationships with the government. I think regardless of where you are, I think we're just in a different state in the world right now. But I don't have the answers on that. Around funding, though, which is my expertise, private funding is a mixed bag as well. I mean, there's a huge spectrum and type of philanthropies and individuals and how much flexibility you're going to be given. I would caution that it's not often more reliable because you are relying on, again, a group of people, boards and organizations, which are going to shift priorities over time. So I think this is the moment when we really need to dig deep on creativity and focus on the right questions for, as you said, liberating ourselves and thinking about what's next. We've talked a little bit about earned revenue. That might be part of it, but I think there's probably solutions that we haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah, I mean, I would add just that the asking the right questions goes back to why do you exist? What are you here to do? Start with that. It's such a tough question. My work with nonprofits, it's a challenge. Many people can repeat their lovely mission statement, but if you ask them, okay, why, what for, they really struggle. It's that upstream question that should define everything. You have to really grapple with that. Another great, anyone else want to come in on that point before I move to the next question?
Just maybe quickly, I think there are some real practical implications to understand if you're, for the first time, for example, making a shift between institutional to funding to private philanthropy. It in a way requires a lot of unlearning for many organizations now that we're seeing firsthand grappling with as well as part of this transformation, because relationships work different. It's not an RFP bid process the same as one would go about it. A commitment to a broader community and strategy is really important. And I also think there are very practical operational things around like overhead structure and how your organization might not be entirely geared for that. That would require transformation to even make that shift.
Let's move on to the second question that's in the Q&A from Lisa Key. What strategies have you found most helpful in supporting executives engage boards that may be more reticent or removed from these issues and help them move the conversation forward? I think this is a really, really tangible issue. Also, this person is curious how you are all thinking about trying to support the tidal pools and other ecosystem infrastructure pieces that have been or are being lost. Do you guys want to respond to both of those points? Let's start with the point about let's start with the point about the tidal pools, the ecosystem infrastructure, other things that are being lost, because I think this speaks to kind of some of the practical tools that you're able to provide. And then let's get into the kind of more discursive issue of the more culture issue about how you engage boards.
Yeah, I can start on the title pools. I mean, I think that we'll have some thoughts out in written form in the next few weeks, I think. But we're seeing efforts from kind of more collective data rescue efforts, that are out there. A lot of those focused a little bit more on federal data. I think there isn't yet a really good and kind of clear set of infrastructure or frankly, a group of funders behind what does it look like to kind of support meaningful infrastructure. I think it's also not good enough to say, well, let's just, scrape everything and get it into, a repository somewhere. There has to be some level of kind of curation and thought in terms of, what are the types of resources that the community needs in the future? Who has been working on this? How can those be safeguarded? I just talked to someone yesterday who had been laid off from one of the larger, INGOs and had been working on a program that was really focused on kind of knowledge products and supporting a specific community. And I asked, if he knew what was happening to all of those knowledge products, and he said, I don't know if anyone's going to be kind of taking care of that, if there's any, kind of attention or kind of interest even internally. And I think that's another piece to it, is it's not just about when organizations fold, it's when teams get shut down or programs end. And so I think there needs to be two things. One is, just within nonprofit leadership, thinking about knowledge management and thinking about knowledge sharing as an important public good that your organization sees as part of its mission. And then I do think that there needs to be some movement, particularly I think from funders and thinking about, as we look at, the next 12 to 18 months and potentially many more organizations, finding the end of their runway. How do we support, it can be pretty simple technical infrastructure, but again, I think the curation and the rehoming and kind of finding proper use for that is ultimately a bigger, more important question than the technology.
I just want to jump in on that, Josh, and say I think this is one of those strategic places where philanthropy can play a role, right? This is something that's manageable within our budget size and kind of our scope. And I encourage folks who are at this place to have really honest conversations with their funders. We have, even prior to 2025, given small grants to what's the word we use? I don't know, appropriately or consciously close down organizations so that we're capturing as much of that data and infrastructure as possible. And then there's some really interesting experts in the field who your program officers or others might be able to help matchmake you with that.
I'd love to get to this question about how you support executives engage boards who might be a little reticent or a little bit removed.
Yeah, I think a big piece of this that we've seen through our accompaniment is it's about knowing your board. Some boards respond to data, some people respond to stories, and some people want to really be part of the process, right? So how do you bring them along in a way that makes them feel included? So it's not a rubber stamp at the end, but they really feel like they were part of the process. But that requires understanding the individual personalities and sort of the personality of the whole of your board, which is incredibly important. Um, so this is, I would say, really a one-on-one, case-by-case situation here. I think boards in general respond to people who are able to make decisions and to say we're moving towards transformation with a vision in mind and keeping the mission at the heart versus from a place of fear. Because if you're doing that from a place of fear, circumstances are going to change tomorrow. So you're likely going to flip-flop again. So having a North Star that you can present and saying, this is why we're thinking through this, coupling that with a narrative and data, and bringing people along for the process is some of the high-level things that I think are really important, but it is a case by case.
I think, Sherry, that idea of not starting from a point of fear, for me, echoes something you said earlier, remembering, forcing us to think about our assets, not just our programs. And we've only got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to give you each like 3 seconds to kind of just respond, give me a closing thought. Um, and Nick Haley, I just see you posted a question. I'm not sure we're going to have time to get to it, but maybe someone wants to reflect this in their closing thoughts. Any learning on keeping back office colleagues motivated through a merger? Um, how do we leave people thinking, okay, this could be something positive? Not running it, not going into this idea of restructuring or mergers or really drastic partnerships because they're forced, because they have to, even though, our hands were forced. But this could be really positive. I'd love just a kind of closing thought from each of you on that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to post the websites of all our organizations in chat so people can follow up with us if they want to.
I can kick us off. I mean, I think one thing that people need is they need to see examples and models. And one of the things I've heard a lot over the last few months is, well, everyone's talking about this, but no one's doing it, which, we can obviously say through our own experiences is incorrect. And there's, I think 7 or 8 active partnerships, that we're supporting at the moment. Not all of them I'm confident will go through, but I think a number will in the first half of the year. And I think being able to point to examples, particularly as Sherry said, examples that are not just out of fear, but where there's a really compelling vision for how that partnership is going to achieve the mission.
I would maybe just like to add, and maybe this also in a way answers Nick Haley's question. A lot of this, Nick, I think is care work. It's vulnerable. We're all dealing with immense precarity. And so just as I was talking about bringing your board along, I think it's also about bringing your team along, making sure that you communicate, not saying tell people really positive stories, but be transparent as you can be to the extent that it's helpful, and see where people have needs and speak to those needs where people need encouragement. And yeah, everyone needs a bit of hope and encouragement and care these days. So the more we can prioritize that as leaders, the better.
Mm.
Uh, I love this as care work. I mean, I think so much of what we're doing right now is care work, but I'll just respond to Lewis's question really quick and to say, I think you're right. I think funders need to be pushed a little bit on this. It's not particularly sexy or exciting to fund back office mergers, but it's absolutely critical work. And so I think we need to be having those conversations amongst ourselves, and feel free to try and raise that with your program officers. And if you want creative ideas on how to sneak line items into budgets to make sure that people get the full cost covered, I'm always happy to connect.
At least two of your teams are going to be really annoyed with you, Rachel. That the budgeting team and the evaluations team. Panelists, thank you so much. Cherry from Accountability Lab, Josh from Development Gateway, Rachel from the Conrad Hilton Foundation. I'm Rajesh Merchandani from Storyteller Consulting. All our website addresses are in the chat. Please look out for us and get in touch with us if we can help you further. Thank you so much for your questions and for your comments and for joining. And yeah, let's keep fighting the good fight, whatever that looks like. Thanks for joining us, everybody.